Michael Cohen's testimony to the House of Representatives continued today in a closed hearing of the House Intelligence Committee. We will be joined by a member of that committee who is also a member of the committee that Michael Cohen testified to publicly yesterday. Michael Cohen spoke to reporters briefly at the end of today's session.
There's not much I can say other than it was very productive. As I said, I'm committed to telling the truth, and I will be back on March 6th to finish up. There's more to discuss. So thank you guys so much. I'm sorry you guys had to stick around all day long.
Intelligence Committee Chairman Adam Schiff confirmed to reporters that Michael Cohen will return next week for another closed session with the Intelligence Committee. He said that at some point, a transcript of Michael Cohen's testimony would eventually be publicly released. Adam Schiff announced that next month the committee would have a public hearing with Felix Sater, a convicted felon with connections to Russian organized crime who maintained an office in Trump Tower.
The following week, on March 14th, we'll have an open interview with Felix Sater on Moscow Trump Tower. I should tell you, just to set your expectations, not every hearing is going to be like the open hearing with Michael Cohen. We're going to try to do as much as we can in open session. Some we can and some we can't.
NBC News has confirmed, reporting by the Daily Beast, that the House Intelligence Committee intends to call Allen Weisselberg, the Trump business chief financial officer, to testify before the committee, according to a source with direct knowledge of that situation. The move comes after Michael Cohen repeatedly cited Allen Weisselberg as having firsthand knowledge of the crimes Michael Cohen described in his testimony involving payoffs to women during the presidential campaign for their silence.
I want to ask a little bit about your conversation with my colleague from Missouri about asset inflation. To your knowledge, did the president ever provide inflated assets to an insurance company?
Yes.
Who else knows that the president did this?
Allen Weisselberg, Ron Lieberman, and Matthew Calamari.
That is just one of the many moments where Allen Weisselberg's name came up in yesterday's hearing. The chairman of yesterday's hearing, Elijah Cummings, said today that the committee will pursue the testimony of Allen Weisselberg and Trump family members.
You said you're going to be following up with some people. Are there people like Allen Weisselberg that he sort of seems...
All you have to do is follow the transcript. If there were names that were mentioned, or records that were mentioned during the hearing, we want to take a look at all of that.
Do you let people in the Trump family, Ivanka Trump, Donald Trump Jr.?
Just follow the transcript.
Would it be fair then to say if any names came up multiple times in that hearing?
They have a good chance of hearing from us.
And we learned today that yesterday's smoking gun almost didn't make it into the hearing. Reporting in Vanity Fair, Emily Jane Fox tells us that Michael Cohen's first draft of his prepared remarks to the committee, which he started writing weeks ago, did not include any exhibits. And when his lawyers told him he would be attacked for being untrustworthy, Michael Cohen went to work in search of documentary evidence that could support his testimony. That's when he found the check signed by Donald Trump in the White House 6 months into the Trump presidency that one member of the committee called the smoking gun yesterday. It is the first check that we have ever seen signed by a president of the United States in the commission of what federal prosecutors in New York City have called a federal crime. And we are fortunate to have Emily Jane Fox in our leadoff panel of guests tonight. Joining us now, Democratic Congressman Raj Krishnamurthy of Illinois, a member of the House Oversight Committee and the House Intelligence Committee. Emily Jane Fox, senior reporter for Vanity Fair and author of Born Trump. And David Cay Johnston is with us. He's the founder of DCReport.org, and he's the author of It's Even Worse Than You Think, What the Trump Administration is Doing in America. David Cay Johnston has been doing investigative reporting on the business of Donald Trump for many years. Emily, we have to start with you. I was almost shaking reading your report that the smoking gun almost didn't make it into the hearing yesterday. Tell us about how Michael Cohen went to work trying to find documentary evidence for his hearing.
It really is a story about the importance of cable news, because Michael Cohen had been working on his statement for weeks. He did have a conversation with his attorneys when they read the draft saying this is very powerful. This is very clear. The lines are very clear, but you're going to have a problem that the Republicans are going to stop you at every turn and try and diminish your credibility and try and attack you. And because these are just anecdotes, they're going to try and discredit these anecdotes. And as he's hearing this, actually Representative Adam Schiff, whose committee he was in front of today, was on television talking about the president's financial documents. And it jogged something in Cohen's memory, and he said, wait a minute, I have some financial documents. I think they're in the boxes that were returned to me from the Southern District of New York from when federal agents executed search warrants on his homes and office. And so he went down to the storage facility in his apartment building that happens to be a Trump-owned apartment building, and he started going through boxes, and there were 9 boxes.
Can I just pause you?
Oh, yeah.
I learned in your report today, it's not just a Trump-owned building. Who else lives in the same building with Michael Cohen?
Funnily enough, Jared and Ivanka keep an apartment in New York.
Jared and Ivanka Trump, their New York apartment is in the same building as Michael Cohen.
It is. I mean, they spend most of their time in Washington now, but they do have a shared apartment.
So he goes down to the basement of this building.
And there are 9 boxes that were returned to him. He goes through box number 1, it's kind of junk. Box number 2, kind of junk. Box number 3, it is jackpot. And what he finds in there are the financial documents from 2011, 2012, 2013. He finds a slew of handwritten notes from the president on articles, things ripped out from magazines and newspapers and printed out from the internet. The notes ranging from threatening, Michael C. threatened this reporter with a lawsuit. This story is terrible, call so-and-so. To an email with Alan Weisselberg, whose name came up, I think, more than 24 times yesterday. And the email was about the reimbursements that Cohen had received for the Stormy Daniels payoff. And it reminded him, well, there have to be copies of these checks somewhere. They're not in this box, but why don't I call the bank? This was all last week. Okay, his draft was written. He was preparing to go to Congress. And so he went to the bank and he got a copy first of this check that is signed by President Trump. And then he got, the day before the hearing, a copy of the check that was signed by Donald Trump Jr. and Alan Weisselberg. So these things were last-minute additions, and they frankly turned the whole hearing around into an anecdotal story that could have had holes poked into it, into something that, as Michael Cohen put it in the hearing, you don't have to believe me. You can say I'm uncredible. That is up to you. But you don't have to believe me because there's documentary proof, and I'm going to put them up on slides in this hearing room, and the whole world can look at them.
Congressman Krishnamurthy, how important were those exhibits in your hearing yesterday?
I think they were very important because they added, some real documentary evidence to corroborate his oral evidence. And, whenever the Republicans kept jumping up and down, screaming that he was a liar, it's very interesting that not once did they, impugn the integrity of the evidence or say that it was somehow false. In fact, it was very hard for them to do so.
And I just want to show the moment that you had yesterday in that hearing, which changed our understanding of what might be happening next in this story when you asked Michael Cohen about any other possible evidence.
Is there any other wrongdoing or illegal act that you are aware of regarding Donald Trump that we haven't yet discussed today?
Yes, and again, those are part of the investigation that's currently being looked at by the Southern District of New York.
Congressman, were you surprised by that answer?
Truthfully, yes. I didn't expect him to answer quite that way. In fact, there was a question right before that question where I actually asked him when was the last time that Donald Trump or one of his agents or advisors reached out to him or communicated with him. And he said it was 2 months after the raid, which is very unusual timing. And then I asked him what was said, and again he said, I can't tell you. That is under investigation by the Southern District of New York, the prosecutors in the Southern District of New York. And so again, I think that there's a lot of information that we still don't know. And certainly anything that's under investigation by the Southern District of New York, I would argue, is something that we should be probing as well in Congress.
And Congressman, you were also one of the few who's in the both hearings, the closed hearing today with the Intelligence Committee. What can you tell us about what happened in that hearing, and especially in terms of consistencies with yesterday's hearing or expansions on what you heard in yesterday's hearing?
Unfortunately, I can't get into the details of the testimony, but I can say a couple things. One, he was very cooperative. Two, there was so much testimony that he was able to give on the questions at issue that he's coming back next Wednesday or on March 6th. And that was not expected today. And so I think that just overall, he's been very cooperative. Going back to the oversight hearing, I thought he came across as credible. And if there's anybody who knows the consequences of lying, especially lying to Congress, it's Michael Cohen, because he's in part going to prison because of that. At this point, I don't see any incentive for him to further lie, because that would only increase his sentence, not decrease it.
What was your judgment of his credibility in today's closed hearing?
I didn't see any inconsistency from the open hearing. He just comes across as a liberated person, Lawrence. I think that he comes across as someone who's like, I'm going to prison in 2 months, and all of a sudden that provides some clarity as to what he needs to be doing right now, which is telling the truth and, of course, putting his affairs in order and taking care of his family. David
K. Johnston, you've spent years trying to get documentary evidence about Trump businesses, but you don't have a key to Michael Cohen's basement. So I'd like to get your reaction to the supporting documentation that Michael Cohen brought to that hearing yesterday, and anything else you think we should be focusing on.
Well, that check is absolutely a smoking gun, and I'm glad that Emily Jane has this terrific story. Shows what good reporting is going on here by journalists. By my count, Michael Cohen identified potentially 14 different crimes in his testimony. My concern is that a lot of that, the dots were not connected. And a lot of the examination was very poor. Now, the congressman who's on our panel and 2 other Congress members, Ms. Ocasio-Cortez and Katie Hill from California, asked very pointed questions that got and elicited important new information, but way too many of the questions were preening. They were time wasted on telling us what we already know. And I hope that the committees in the future do a better job of examining the witnesses.
And David, all of the things you're talking about are things that it could be subjects of future hearings, obviously.
Oh, and I'm sure we're going to see lots of hearings coming forward, particularly now that Cohen has laid out these 14 at least paths to pursue and to decide which of these are more significant. The financial documents are particularly bizarre in that Trump suddenly doubles his net worth to close to $8.7 billion. Remember, that's the figure he mentioned the day he announced he was running for president almost 4 years ago. And what they show is something I've been showing about Donald, including when I got his net worth statement in 1990. He just makes it up. He just makes it up. There's no reality behind it. By the way, I meant to tell you, Lawrence, I was doing my net worth statements this evening, and I'm worth $7 billion.
Congressman, quickly before we go, I wanted to get reacting off of what David just said and his review of the performance of members yesterday, and people saw what they saw, so I don't want to drag you into defending your colleagues, but I want to go to another point.
Well, I think I did great. I agree with that.
You just got a very good review, but I want to go into the private session in this way. It was always my experience working in the Senate that whenever you closed the door and it was a private meeting, every senator performed better in private than they do publicly. No wasted words. Every single comment I always found when the door was closed was much more efficient, much more pointed, much sharper. Is that true when you have a closed door session, say, of the Intelligence Committee as you did today compared to what we saw yesterday?
Great point, Lawrence. I think that when you have those cameras, especially in that open session, I did feel like sometimes when the Republicans talked, it was almost as though they were playing to the cameras. At the start of the oversight hearing yesterday, they interrupted Elijah Cummings not more than 5 words into the hearing to basically move to adjourn or postpone the hearing. And at that moment, I really felt like they were playing to Donald Trump, who apparently was watching live from Vietnam. And so absolutely, when there's a closed-door session, I do think that theatrics goes down, and we actually have a little bit more of a subdued Q&A session.
We can't wait for the transcripts of the closed-door session. Congressman Raja Krishnamurthy, David K. Johnston, Emily Jane Fox, thank you all for starting us off tonight. Really appreciate it. Thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on the button below for more from The Last Word and the rest of MSNBC.